The morning Miss Cecily Holt first spoke to the man everyone called Granger. She was on her knees in the kitchen garden at Ashmore Park, pressing a seedling back into the soil with both hands while the first cold of October settled over the Hertfordshire countryside like a held breath. She had not meant to startle him. She heard boots on the gravel path and looked up, expecting one of the undergardeners, and instead found a tall man in a worn coat watching her with an expression she could not read, the color of river slate in his eyes and a stillness about him that did not belong to someone who groomed horses for a living. "You will lose it," he said, his voice level and low. "The ground is too hard. Planted against the south wall, where the frost comes last." She looked down at the seedling, then back at him. "Thank you," she said simply, and moved to the south wall. He did not leave. He stood at the garden's edge for a moment, and she was aware of his gaze the way one is aware of an open window in a cold room, a quiet and directional pressure. Then he was gone. That was how it began. Not with a ballroom or a calling card, not with a formal introduction or a name offered in the correct drawing-room manner, but with a dying seedling and a stranger who knew which wall held the warmth longest. What she did not yet know was that the man called Granger was not what Ashmore Park believed him to be. What she did not yet know was that his quiet in the garden was the practiced quiet of a man who had learned to observe the world from a position it had not assigned him. And what Cecily Holt did not yet know, in that first moment of looking up from the cold earth, was that nothing about the next 3 months would proceed as she had planned. She had arrived at Ashmore Park in September, in the 3rd week of that season's first chill, accompanying Lady Dorothea Rowe as paid companion, a position that was several degrees lower than Cecily had once been accustomed to, and several degrees higher than the silence of her father's empty house in Shropshire. Her father had died in February. The house was entailed to a cousin she had met twice, a man of 34, with a pleasant manner and no intention of allowing her to remain. The creditors had arrived in April. By June she had accepted the advertisement placed in the Morning Post by Lady Rowe's solicitor, had packed 2 trunks and the small watercolor portrait of her mother that still hung above the writing desk in the room she had occupied since childhood, and had come to Hertfordshire. Lady Rowe was 61 years of age, sharp-eyed and clear-spoken, and not unkind, though she expressed kindness in the manner of someone who had been born to a position that made warmth feel like a concession. She paid on time and asked little beyond presence, a body to play pianoforte in the evenings, to read aloud when her eyesight dimmed, to accompany her in the carriage on calling days, and to keep her household from becoming entirely silent. Cecily performed all of these functions with the quiet competence she had learned in her father's house, and she was careful never to draw attention to herself. She was also careful to remember each morning when she dressed in the room off the servants' corridor that had been assigned to her, that she was no longer Miss Holt of Whitmore Hall. She was, in the vocabulary of Ashmore Park, the companion, an arrangement, a convenience, Lady Rowe's son. Mr. Gerald Rowe was not careful to remember anything of the kind. He arrived from London in the 3rd week of October, a man of 42 with polished boots and a habit of speaking loudly in rooms not built for it, and he looked at Cecily once, at the supper table, and decided she was an ornament placed for his amusement rather than his mother's assistance. He addressed her by her first name within the first evening, called her a sweet little arrangement when he thought she was out of hearing in the corridor, and allowed his eyes to follow her in a manner that made the back of her neck feel like a window latch that had not caught. It was Lady Rowe's neighbor, Mrs. Philpott of Netherwick, who first spoke the label that would pursue Cecily through the autumn. She came for Tuesday calls on the 2nd week of Gerald's visit, sat in the yellow drawing-room with her hands folded over the handle of her walking stick, and said in the tone of one reporting a practical matter, "A companion, is she? I thought perhaps she was some poor relation you had taken in. One can always tell. They have that quality of hoping not to be noticed," Lady Rowe corrected. Nothing. She poured the tea. Cecily heard it from the door, where she had paused with a letter she had been sent to retrieve from the hall, and she held the letter very still, and kept her face toward the corridor, and allowed herself precisely 1 breath before she returned to the drawing-room. set the letter on the tray, and resumed her seat without a word. She had learned to move that way in the months since February, quietly. Precisely, without taking up room that no one had offered her. The man called Granger appeared in her days with no particular frequency, and then with more. She saw him each morning when she walked the kitchen garden before Lady Rowe required her, the narrow path between the box hedges where the air smelled of cold soil and decaying leaves, and something she could not name that was simply the particular scent of October in the English countryside. He was always there ahead of her, either working at the stone wall that divided the kitchen garden from the paddock, or simply standing at the gate with a cup she took to be tea, watching the low hills go pale with morning. He did not speak again for 3 days after the incident with the seedling. On the 4th morning he said, "You are up before the house." "I am always up before the house," she said. "The seedling took," he said. He gestured toward the south wall. She looked. The small plant had straightened, had turned its face toward what light the gray morning offered. She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was clenched. "Thank you for the advice," she said. "It was not advice," he said. "It was an observation." She looked at him then fully, for the first time. His coat was dark wool, plain, mended at one cuff. His hands rested on the gate rail with the particular ease of a man accustomed to waiting. The river slate eyes were direct, and she noticed now that they were set above a jaw that carried something of the same quality she had once observed in a piece of carved chalk. Her father had kept on his desk a material that looked soft and proved, under the hand, to be very hard indeed. Then, "Thank you for the observation," she said, and went in to breakfast. She told herself nothing about the conversation, because there was nothing to tell. He was the stable master, she was the companion. The distance between them on the social register of Ashmore Park was approximately the distance between the East Wing and the servants' quarters, and neither of them lived in either. What she did not yet allow herself to consider was why she found herself thinking of his voice, level and low at intervals throughout the day that made no sense to her. She did not consider it, because to consider it would have been to admit that something had begun, and she was not prepared to begin anything. She had come to Ashmore Park to endure. If staying to hear more of his observations began to feel, by the 2nd week of October, less like chance and more like intention, she did not examine that distinction too closely either. It was on a Thursday, toward the end of the month, that Gerald Rowe found her alone in the library. She had been there an hour, reading aloud to herself in preparation for the evening, when she heard the door open and Gerald's voice asking whether this was where she hid herself, and she closed the book and stood, because standing was the only posture that gave her any reliable sense of the room's geography. He was 3 steps into the library when she said, "Lady Rowe will be expecting me in the drawing-room at 4. He checked. He looked at the mantel clock. "It is barely past 2, he said. "Then I had best go and be early," she said, and moved toward the door, at the precise angle that required him to step aside rather than forward. He stepped aside, because the alternative was a gesture he could not quite make himself make, with the afternoon light falling through the library windows, in a way that made everything a little too visible, and she was out of the room before he had closed his mouth. She did not shake until she reached the corridor. She had not been 5 steps from the library door when she heard it open again behind her, and the step on the hall floorboards was not Gerald's. She recognized the weight of it before she turned, the particular economy of a footstep that made no more noise than was required. Granger stood in the corridor. He was carrying a length of leather harness that made no sense in this part of the house. His eyes moved from her face to the library door and back to her face, and something passed through them that she could not name, quick and dark, before his expression returned to the flat stillness she had come to know. "The stable block roof is leaking," he said, his voice level. "I came to find the steward." "The steward is in the east wing," she said. "Thank you," he said. He did not move immediately. He stood in the corridor with the harness in his hands and his eyes on her face, and she felt the warmth of his attention like the south wall in October, a thing that cost him nothing, and somehow cost her very much. And then he turned and walked toward the east wing without another word. She went to the drawing room, sat down, picked up her mending, and did not allow her hands to shake. What she did not know, and what she would not know for another 3 weeks, was that he had not been looking for the steward at all. The dinner party happened on the first Saturday of November, when Ashmore Park's dining room was laid for 20, and the candles burned in their silver stands above white linen that reflected the light back until the table seemed to float, and Lady Rowe sat at one end in her gray silk, with the diamonds her late husband had given her on their first anniversary, and Gerald sat at the other end in a coat that had cost more than Cecily's quarterly salary, and Cecily sat in the middle distance between them, in her second-best gray gown, with the mended lace at the cuffs. The guests were the neighborhood's principal families, come to inspect one another over the saddle of lamb and the syllabub, and they brought with them the accumulated social intelligence of the county, all of which they distributed with the precision of people who understood that information was a currency, and that dinner parties were the exchange. It was Mrs. Philpott who raised Cecily's station as a topic of conversation, in the mild and wondering tone of someone who had not yet resolved a small puzzle. "I wonder sometimes," she said to the woman on her left, which was Lady Sefton in a voice calibrated to carry just beyond her own chair, "what it cost to engage a companion of good family. One assumes the circumstances must be quite reduced for a woman of education to accept such a position." Lady Sefton said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. "There is something touching about it," Mrs. Philpott continued. "The companion class, I mean. They are so determined to be invisible. One can always tell. They have that quality of hoping not to be noticed." This was the second time she had said it. The table heard it. The syllabub arrived, and the conversation moved on, and Cecily sat in the middle distance, with her hands in her lap and her face arranged into the expression she had spent 9 months perfecting, which was the expression of a woman who had not heard, and did not mind, and was not present in any way that counted. She was aware in the particular peripheral manner she had developed of Granger's absence from the room, which was reasonable because he had no reason to be there. He was the stable master. He ate in the servants' hall. What she noticed was that the table did not seem quite right in some way she could not articulate, that something in the arrangement of persons was slightly off, like a piece of furniture moved 3 inches from where memory placed it. She noticed it, and then the syllabub was finished, and the women rose for the drawing-room, and she followed Lady Rowe, and forgot about it in the work of making 20 people comfortable in a room designed for 12. The next morning she was in the kitchen garden at 7:30, and Granger was at the gate. He did not begin with pleasantries. He rarely did. "You did not eat your supper," he said. She stopped. "I beg your pardon." "At dinner," he said. The syllabub went back to the kitchen untouched. She stared at him. "How could you possibly know what I ate at dinner?" He was quiet for a moment, the river slate gaze moving over her face. Then he said, "The cook mentioned it." She did not believe him. She filed that knowledge away, and did not examine it, because to examine it was to arrive somewhere she was not yet ready to stand. "I was not hungry," she said. "Eat something," he said. He set something on the gate rail, turned, and walked toward the stable block before she reached it. It was a small cloth-wrapped parcel. Inside she found 2 bread rolls from the kitchen, warm enough that they must have come from this morning's baking, and a piece of aged cheese that she recognized as the good kind, the sort that appeared on the dining-room board rather than the servants' table. She stood in the cold October morning, and held the parcel, and felt something shift in her chest, slow and tectonic, that frightened her a little. She ate the rolls standing up in the kitchen garden, with the seedling she had planted against the south wall green and determined 6 inches from her right boot. What she still did not know, that morning, was anything true about the man who had brought them. It was Lady Rowe herself who told her, on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of November, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for reporting useful domestic arrangements. "I should tell you Lady Rose said from her chair by the fire with her needlework in her lap, "that our stable-master is not precisely what he appears." Cecily looked up from the reading she had been preparing. "Mr. Sebel—" "Granger," said Lady Rowe, "is Mr. Nicholas Granger, Viscount Oldham, of the Derbyshire Oldham family. He is 34 years old. He came to Ashmore Park in March, at my specific invitation, and he has been managing the stables since April. He prefers not to be introduced." Cecily held the book in her hands and did not speak. "He had a difficult few years," Lady Rose said, returning her eyes to her needlework. "His wife died in childbed 18 months ago. The child also. He came to believe, as men sometimes will, that his rank was the thing that had required her to be where she was in that particular house, with that particular physician, when a midwife from the village might have attended her better. He wished to be somewhere that no one expected anything of him on the basis of a title." She paused. "I am his godmother. I offered him what I could. A log settled in the grate." Outside, the November wind pressed against the window glass. "He has not told you," Lady Rose said. It was not a question. "No," Cecily said. "He would not," Lady Rose said. "He is very careful. He has been careful with everyone here. He does not wish to trade on what he is." She looked up from the needlework then, and her eyes, sharp and pale gray, settled on Cecily's face with an attention that was not casual. "You are the only person at Ashmore Park who has treated him as though his coat were irrelevant." Cecily felt the heat rise in her face and had nowhere to put it. "I did not know who he was," she said. "I know," said Lady Rowe. "That is precisely what I mean." She returned to her needlework, and Cecily returned to her book, and neither of them spoke again about the matter that afternoon. There was very little more to be said. The saying of it was already done. If you have stayed this long with Cecily's story, you know already what she could not yet admit to herself. Stay a little longer. The moment she has not yet seen is close. The following morning she went to the kitchen garden. He was at the gate. She did not pretend she had not been told. She had spent the night deciding that pretending would be its own small dishonesty, and she had decided against it. "I know who you are," she said. He was still for a moment. The river slate eyes found her face, and stayed there. "Lady Rowe told you," he said. "Yes." He said nothing for a long time. The morning was very cold, the first hard frost of November having come in the night, and the kitchen garden was pale and glittering in the early light, and the seedling against the south wall was drooping. "It does not change anything," she said. He looked at her. "It changes how you see me." "No," she said carefully. "It adds to how I see you. It does not change what I already saw." Something happened then in his face, in the jaw and around the eyes, quick and involuntary, that she had not seen there before. Not softening, exactly. More like the particular stillness that follows, when a thing that has been braced against expected impact finds that the impact has not come. He said, his voice very low, "What did you see?" She thought about the south wall, about the bread rolls and the good cheese and the harness that made no sense in the corridor of the main house, about a man who could have lived in the east wing and had chosen the stable block. "A man," she said. "Just that." He looked at her for a long time, and she held his gaze, because looking away from it felt like a dishonesty she was not willing to commit. "I am sorry," he said, "for not telling you. You owed me nothing," she said. "You do not owe anyone here a truth they have not yet earned." He was quiet again. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "Her name was Frances," he said. She was afraid of the dark. She made me leave a candle in the passage each night because she could not sleep otherwise. She was not afraid of anything else I ever saw her meet. He stopped. "I keep thinking of the candle." She felt the ache of it in her own chest, that specific grief of small things left burning for someone who would not return to them, and she did not fill the silence with anything, because the silence was not hers to fill. He would not let himself say anything more that morning. She could see the cost of the words already spoken in the set of his shoulders, and she did not ask for more. What he had given was already more than she had expected. They stood in the cold garden for a while longer, not touching, not speaking, and the frost sparkled on the seedlings' leaves, and the morning widened slowly around them, and neither of them was invisible to the other. Gerald Rowe's attempt came the following Sunday. He had been watching in the particular way that men watch when they have decided to consider a woman's reluctance as a problem of logistics rather than a statement of fact. He had been watching since October, and by mid-November he had mapped enough of Cecily's daily movement to know when she would be in certain rooms and alone. On Sunday evening, after the house had settled, he found her in the small sitting room off the east corridor where she customarily spent the hour before bed reading by lamplight. He entered without knocking. She stood immediately. She had learned in the autumn to do that. To always stand. He said, in the generous voice of a man doing someone a favor, that he had been thinking about her situation and found it unsatisfactory, and that he was in a position to improve it if she were sensible about the matter. She said in the level voice of a woman who had given this possibility no invitation, "I am Lady Rowe's companion. My situation is precisely as it should be." He said that her salary must be inadequate, and that he had always admired women of spirit. She said, "Good evening, Mr. Rowe," and moved toward the door. He was between her and the door. He took one step forward, and she saw on his face the particular expression of a man who had decided that the logistics of the room were now in his favor. The door opened. Nicholas stepped through it. He was in his plain dark coat, not changed for the house, and his face was entirely still. He looked at Gerald Rowe with the river-slate eyes that she knew now could hold whatever weight was placed in them, and he said, his voice exactly level, "Lady Rowe requires Miss Holt." Gerald Rowe looked at him with the considering air of a man deciding whether to assert his position over a servant. Nicholas held his gaze. He did not shift his weight. He did not step back. Then he looked at Cecily, then back at Nicholas, and something in the quality of the stillness he was meeting made him step sideways. Cecily walked through the door. In the corridor, she did not ask Nicholas how he had known. She did not ask why he had come. She walked at his side, in the direction of Lady Rowe's drawing room, where she had not in fact been summoned. And she kept her breathing even, and when they were 3 turns from the sitting room, and the sound of Gerald's footstep was not behind them, she stopped. "Thank you," she said. "Lady Rowe is perfectly well," he said. "She did not send for you." "I know," she said. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. The quality of it was not the practiced stillness of the gate and the garden. It was the stillness of something that had been very carefully held in reserve and was no longer sure it wished to remain so. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it as though it had been said in a language she already knew but had not heard spoken aloud in a very long time, and the pull of it went through her in a single quiet movement from the throat down. "Yes," she said. It was not an answer to anything he had asked, because he had not asked anything. It was something else. They both knew what it was. He lifted his hand, and she thought for a moment he would touch her face. And she held very still, her pulse high, and visible in her own awareness. His hand rose to a point just at the air beside her jaw, a precise and deliberate hesitation, and then he lowered it. "Not here," he said. "Not in this house. Not while nothing is settled." She understood him. She understood that what he meant was not yet. That what he meant was that he would not have the first honest thing between them occur in a corridor under Gerald Rowe's roof. She felt the discipline in it as tenderness rather than refusal. She felt it in her own body, the pull and the restraint both as specific and real as the cold of the November morning in the garden. "Then settle something," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The river-slate eyes were very steady. "I intend to," he said. The crisis arrived 8 days later. At the dinner Lady Rowe held for the neighborhood's important families, the one that would close the autumn season before the roads became too difficult for calling. Gerald had been building toward it. Cecily had felt the structure of it assembling itself over the preceding days, the way a storm is felt in the air before the clouds arrive, a change in pressure rather than a visible cause. He had said something to Mrs. Secchi, Philpott, or to Lady Sefton, or to both, and the something had been of the kind that circulated through a neighborhood with the efficiency of water seeking its level. Cecily was not certain of the particulars, because the particulars did not reach her directly. What reached her was the change in how the drawing-room arranged itself when she entered. The way eyes met and separated, the way Mrs. Copley. Philpott's gaze held a new quality of satisfied attention. She learned what had been said from Lady Rose's own maid, who told it to the housekeeper, who let it fall in the kitchen in Cecily's hearing, as servants sometimes do when they believe the relevant party is too reduced to matter. Gerald had been intimating to the interested parties of the neighborhood that the companion had been encouraging an unsuitability, that she had been conducting herself with a freedom inappropriate to her station, that Lady Rose's household contained, in short, the wrong sort of arrangement. The wrong sort of arrangement. Cecily sat with this for 1 hour, in the cold of her room, and then she dressed for the dinner. The dining room was laid for 16 that evening, and the candles were in their silver stands, and Lady Rose sat at one end in her best grey silk, and Gerald at the other in his London coat, and Mrs. Philpott sat at Lady Rose's left hand, which was the place of consequence, and Cecily sat in the middle of the table in her grey gown with the mended lace, and she ate her supper without tasting it, and kept her face arranged into the expression of a woman who was present in every way, except the one that could be used against her. He was not at the dinner table. He was never at the dinner table. He had sent word that afternoon, through the housekeeper, that he would be traveling the following week. Cecily had received this information at 4 o'clock, with the flat sensation of a woman who has built a wall very carefully in the dark, and has just felt the first stone shift. The fish course came and went. The lamb arrived. Mrs. Philpott, who had been warming to her subject throughout the soup, found her moment between the lamb and the syllabub, in the conversational lull that always fell when the footmen were removing the first covers. "It is a concern," she said in the direction of Lady Sefton, in the voice she used for practical matters. "When a household loses its standards of propriety, one feels for Lady Rowe, whose generosity in taking in persons of reduced circumstance does her credit, though the results are not always what one might hope." She did not look at Cecily. She did not need to. Everyone else did. Cecily put down her fork. She did not speak. She did not raise her eyes. She took one long, deliberate breath, and then she felt the table shift its attention away from her, because there was a sound at the door. Nicholas walked into the dining room. He was not in his plain dark coat. He wore a deep, blue-fitted coat over a white cravat, his dark hair brushed back from a face that was exactly as it had always been, the jaw and the river-slate eyes, and the practiced stillness, except that he carried all of it now without the permission of a stable block. He walked into the dining room at Ashmore Park, with the unhurried step of a man who had been in many such rooms, and did not require an invitation to stand in one. He walked directly to Lady Rowe, who received him with the composed expression of a woman who had expected him to arrive at some point this evening. "Nicholas," she said. And the name sat in the room and changed the room. Every head at the table had turned. Gerald Rowe was staring. Mrs. Philpott had stopped speaking mid-sentence, her fan held at a slight distance from her chest, the syllabub untouched on the cloth before her. Nicholas looked down the table. He found Cecily's face and held it for 3 seconds, long enough that no one at the table could mistake it for anything but what it was. Then he looked at Mrs. Philpott. "I am Nicholas Granger, Viscount Aldham," he said. "I have been a guest at Ashmore Park since March. I should have made myself known to the neighborhood sooner. I apologize for the confusion my presence may have caused." No one spoke. He walked to the one empty chair at the table which was 3 places from Cecily, and he sat down. Philpott said after a moment, "But surely," in the voice of someone attempting to reconstruct a wall that has already been demolished, and then stopped, because there was nothing to add to it that would not require her to say something irrecoverable aloud. Lady Sefton said, with the calm of a woman of genuine social authority. "Lord Oldham, how good that you could join us." Gerald Rowe said nothing. His face had the specific blankness of a man recalculating very rapidly. Lady Rowe said Gerald pour the Viscount some wine, and Gerald poured the wine, because the sentence left him no other available action. The dinner proceeded. Cecily sat in her grey gown with the mended lace and kept her breathing even, and she did not look at Nicholas again until the men had joined the ladies, after port, and he crossed the drawing-room to where she stood near the window, and then she looked at him fully and clearly, because she owed that much to honesty. He stopped within a proper conversational distance. No closer. "I did not plan that entry," he said. "I know," she said. "I was going to speak to you first," he said, privately. "I intended to speak to you before any of this." "You said you intended to settle something," she said. "I did settle something," he said. "It is done." "I did not say it gracefully." "No," she said. "You did not." A very small thing passed across his face. She thought it might have been almost the beginning of something like relief. He said, his voice lower, the words for her and not the room. "Cecily, I do not want you to mistake what this evening was. I did not stand up at that table for the neighborhood. I did not stand up for my own reputation, such as it is. I stood up because Mrs. Philpott was saying something about you that was untrue, and I found I could not continue to sit at the table in a dark coat while she said it." She felt that in her chest, slow and warm. "And," he said, "because I have been wanting to ask you something, and I was not going to ask it while you were sitting in that chair being reduced to an arrangement." She held herself very still. The drawing-room moved around them, the murmur of voices and the clink of teacups and the fire in the grate, all of it happening at a slight distance, as though the particular square of air they occupied had become its own country with its own rules. "Miss Holt," he said, and the formality of it, after the given name in the corridor, was its own kind of tenderness. "Cecily, I am asking you to consider whether you would agree to be my wife." She looked at him for a long time. The River Slade eyes were entirely steady. There was no performance in them and no agenda. There was only the man she had learned against a south wall and a kitchen gate and a corridor harness and a parcel of warm bread, present and direct and waiting. "Yes," she said. She said it quietly. It was not a dramatic word. It was a plain word. It was, she thought, exactly the right size for the thing she meant by it. He was still for a moment. Then his hand moved and found hers, gloved and brief, a pressure and a warmth. He held it for 4 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than propriety required, and 2 seconds shorter than what she wanted. And then he released it, because the drawing-room was still the drawing-room. "I would like to call on you in the morning," he said, "properly with Lady Rowe present." "Come at 10, she said. "I will be in the morning room." He would later say that he had not smiled in that moment. She would later say she had not believed him. The morning was cold and bright, and the first snow of winter lay in a thin coat over the kitchen garden, over the path between the box hedges, over the south wall, and the seedling beneath it had survived. It was not a grand thing. One small plant's survival of a Hertfordshire winter. Plants managed it daily, all across the county without requiring witnesses or ceremonies. There was no reason to stand in the garden at 7:30 on a November morning and feel at the sight of those small green leaves showing through the snow that the season had kept its word. Cecily stood there, anyway. She heard his step on the gravel before she heard anything else, the particular weight of it, and she did not turn immediately. She listened to him come to a stop beside her, and she felt the warmth of him at her shoulder in the cold morning air, and she looked at the seedling. "It held," she said. "South wall," he said, his voice close. It was always going to hold. She turned to look at him. The gray morning light was on his face, and he was not wearing the plain dark coat. He had come from the house, already dressed for calling, in the deep blue coat and the white cravat, and he looked exactly as he had always looked and also entirely different. and she understood that this was what it was to see someone without the distance that uncertainty required. He lifted his hand, and she did not hold still. She turned her face into it, the clean, cold leather of his glove at her cheek, and she let herself feel that without managing it, without placing it at a useful distance. "You are cold," he said. "Yes," she said. "Come inside," he said, and the words carried exactly what they always had, the authority and the protection and the warmth under both. And this time she heard all three parts of it clearly. She took his arm. They walked out of the kitchen garden together, past the south wall, through the gate that had been the geography of all their early mornings, and into the house that would not be hers for another 4 months. When the bands were called for the third and final time at the church in Alton, and the neighbors of the Derbyshire estate assembled in the cold stone nave and watched a woman in a cream gown with a small posy of early spring flowers walk the aisle on Lady Rose's arm. Mrs. Philpott was not invited. She sent a card. By the following spring, the seedling against the south wall at Ashmore Park had grown into something that was beginning at last to look like a proper plant. Lady Rowe reported this in a letter to Derbyshire in May, in the dry and careful prose of a woman who did not deal in sentiment but understood which small facts would carry the most weight in the right hands. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Cecily read it by the window of the morning room in the Oldham house, which was hers now in the plain and settled sense of a woman who has been named to a place by someone whose naming of it could not be undone. The fire was low behind her, and the May light was on the paper, and outside the window the parkland ran green and unguarded to the edge of the stone wall, and somewhere below she could hear Nicholas in the hall speaking to the steward about the east field. She folded the letter and held it for a moment. She thought of the kitchen garden. She thought of the small plant pressing back into the cold earth, and the voice that had said, level and without ceremony, that the ground was too hard, planted against the south wall where the frost comes last. She had not known, in that moment, that the observation had been about her. She thought, as she set the letter on the writing desk beside the small watercolor portrait of her mother, that she had always known. The afternoon light moved across the floor in a long, slow rectangle, and in the hall below Nicholas's voice and the steward's voice arrived at an agreement, and the house settled around it the way a house does when the right people are inside it. Thank you for staying until the end of Cecily's story. If a particular moment in it stayed with you, we would be glad to know which one.